Thank you very much, Professor Rockström, for this very powerful message, sobering message, and this very important call to action. Many marketers, many citizens are hearing all these worrying data, all this worrying evidence about increasing indications of climate change, and some of them start almost losing confidence that they will be able to turn it around. Are there reasons for which we can still remain confident as citizens, but also here as marketers? We have a conference of marketers in order to turn around what seems almost inevitable.
Yeah, thanks, and great to be with you and have this opportunity to communicate with such an important group of change agents in the world. I mean, the World Federation of Advertisers is absolutely fundamental exactly on this question. What is the narrative? What is the narrative of our prospects of being able to land safely in not only a stable and resilient and planet that can support us, but also in an equitable way? Scientifically, the conclusion is that despite all the evidence we have that we're approaching tipping points, we are approaching tipping points, meaning that the window is, as far as we can tell from our scientific knowledge today, still open for us. We still have this opportunity of landing within a safe operating space of a manageable and stable planet. Now, the conclusion that often is put forward that it's no longer possible to succeed is when you combine an assessment of our political, economic, and in many cases also individual behavioral willingness to actually step up to the challenge. So don't accuse us as the biophysical Earth system scientists of concluding that we do not have a chance of landing in a safe way. It is when you combine it with your assessment of the political willingness to change, of the economic ability to change, that you can come to different conclusions. But from a pure climate scientific perspective, what we know today is that we are still within the realm of possibility. And this is what strikes me as creating what I call the double frustration. Because frustration one is that we have unequivocal scientific evidence that we are facing potentially catastrophic risks. We're not there yet, but we're facing them. And we have unequivocal evidence that we have the solutions and that the solutions can give even better outcomes for humanity. So it's a double frustration that why risk the future for all generations on Earth when we have a pathway that can take us to the right place we want to be.
Some climate activists in these discussions assert that economic growth is per se not compatible with a sustainable life on the planet. What is your view on that? Do you see these as in contradiction, or can you actually envisage a future where both are compatible?
Yeah, I really dislike focusing that discussion on economic growth. I'm completely agnostic to growth. I don't think that should be our parameter, our criteria for success. What we are concerned with is human well-being, and therefore we should emphasize much more measurements of the well-being, wealth economics, which is to integrate parameters of health, of life quality, of life expectancy, and of happiness with the world around us, and not only measure GDP as a measure of progress. If we measure economic growth in conventional terms, as often is done with GDP, then we are in trouble. Then there is a contradiction, meaning that we cannot have infinite GDP growth, which is based on a linear model where we start by exploiting resources, capital, and the climate system in the planet, and we transform this to goods and services to humanity and the economy, and we create waste and impacts in the other end. That linear system translated into GDP growth is not compatible with a sustainable future. But we have so much evidence that we can create a harmonized development pathway where we align economic development, yes, with a safe operating space on Earth. I would like to see economic development, innovation, prosperity, and equity within the safe operating space of planetary boundaries. I do not see why that would be impossible. On the contrary, actually, I see more and more evidence that if you put scientific targets of hard sustainability, quantitative science-based targets of planetary boundaries, like the 1.5 degrees Celsius guardrail on climate, it unleashes even more innovation. It gives even more prospects of zero carbon technologies and practices, which then can accelerate the development towards an even better economic development. But it's a different economic development. It's not measured according to the degree by which you are destroying and undermining life support systems. It's measured within a circular, systems-based approach that aligns itself with the stability of the planet. That's the magic. How do we integrate the stability of the planet with economics?
We're getting questions from the audience, and I encourage the audience to share those questions as we dialogue. One of the questions coming in is, are there learnings in terms of how daily consumer habits can actually positively impact the environment, such as, for example, eating a lot of meat and dairy, etc.? And I think what's implied in this question is, what can individuals do in their choices which are most effective in terms of the impact on climate?
That's a really good question, and it's a challenging question because I really like to emphasize that Sir David Attenborough, when he ended his intervention for this session, he said, "We are all planetary stewards," and that is the correct conclusion. Every individual today must act every day locally, but at the same time be a planetary steward. How do we do that? Well, in fact, there are tools to do it. For example, the world needs to follow the carbon law of cutting emissions by half every decade. Well, when you think of it, that scientifically based law, can actually be applied for you, for me, for a household, for anyone at any scale. So I can adopt the carbon law and say that from now on, I'm going to cut my own emissions by half every decade. I'm going to download a carbon calculator on my mobile phone, and I'm going to calculate how much I emit, and I'm going to cut emissions by half by reducing my fossil fuel-based mobility, by eating more plant-based diets, by reducing my waste production. And that, to me, is a way of connecting a planetary responsibility with local action. But my most important response to that question is actually not how we act in everyday behavior, which is fundamental, but how we talk to each other, what conversations we have, what narrative we start sharing with each other to create the excitement about sustainability as the pathway for modernity, that this is the next level of success and responsibility for us all. That is what I think we truly can do. There's no excuse to not be aligned with the latest thinking on how we become planetary stewards and reconnect to the planet.
A question which is currently the most voted on, which is about marketing and your message to marketers. So marketing is traditionally seen as a driver of consumption. And so what would be your message to marketers about its future role in a future which we envisage to be sustainable, which we seek to be sustainable?
Yeah, I would say there are different elements here. I mean, scientifically, I would have this dream of marketing, which is always placing the consumer good, the product, the service within the context of how it's positioned in the value chain of the safe operating space within the planet. How does it match quantitative targets on climate, on biodiversity, on water, on land, depending on what goods and services they are? So that's one part. But secondly, I think it's really about quality, about marketing responsibility, to say, look here, we are now marketing a good X, and look at the entire value chain from farmer's field to fork, from source to consumer good, and take responsibility right through that whole chain. And we are really taking a conscious responsibility for the whole system. And I think more of that kind of marketing, I also think, can send signals that we're no longer, we cannot succeed if we continue in our kind of trashing type consumer-based behavior where we just consume and waste, but instead being much more conscious about responsibility for our own consumption. I think the marketing can play an important role there.
The planet has come to a halt, a temporary halt, with the pandemic. It's partly actually still under lockdown. Do you feel that the coronavirus will have an impact on the way we look at climate change and the way we mobilize on climate change?
The answer is yes. It's even a strong yes, but not in the way that you might expect. Yes, there was a decline, a temporary decline in emissions due to the catastrophe caused by the pandemic. Was that a good thing? The answer is no. It was definitely not a good thing, because we want under no circumstances start sending the signal that the only way to succeed in reducing emission of greenhouse gases and thereby the threat on the climate crisis is by destroying the economy, by destroying jobs, by having negative impacts on societies. That is, of course, not the pathway. And remember that the global emissions have already rebounded, so we didn't even get any benefits from that decline. So that's not the lesson at all. But the lesson is the following: that the pandemic caused the biggest crisis in the world economy since the 1930s, since the Second World War. And what did it translate to? It translated to global emissions reductions of 6%, 7%. That is the pace of reductions that we now have to accomplish every year so that we can land safely on a fossil fuel-free world economy by the year 2050, following the carbon law. Cutting emissions by half translates to exactly the same pace as the pandemic shock caused. This just reminds us of the scale of the challenge. And our task is, of course, to do this in a way that benefits economies, that benefits jobs, and that benefits livelihoods of communities. So now is the time to recognize the scale and pace of the challenge. And finally, I think a lesson of the pandemic is really that it shows that we're all interconnected, that we really are a big world on a very small planet. The virus reminds us of how incredibly fast invoices can be sent from one catastrophe in a small spot on Earth, and it just propels across the whole world. And that's exactly what we are concerned about scientifically when it comes to the risk of destabilizing the Amazon rainforest, destabilizing the Atlantic overturning of heat, destabilizing the West Antarctic ice shelf. So it's the same understanding. And I think the pandemic has taught us that now is the time to secure the stability of all biophysical systems on Earth, because they can hit as pandemic, but they can hit as tipping points.
Professor Rockström, we look at COP26 in November, and the run-up to COP26, that conversation around the need to mobilize on climate change is certainly going to be increasing. The momentum will strengthen. What do you expect will happen in COP26? I mean, I'll ask you to look into your crystal ball, but how do you see nations come together in November in Glasgow? Where do you see this going? You know, what should we realistically expect in 7 months' time, if I may ask?
Well, what are the must-haves? Well, one must-have is that all nations in the world need to update their national commitment plans, their NDCs, to align with science, so that we have plans that align so we can stay well below 2 and aim for 1.5. So that's number one. Number two is we need money on the table, not billions, but trillions, to be able to invest and support developing countries in the transition. And number three, we need to really start talking about the economic policies that makes a fair incentive scheme for decarbonizing fast. For example, a price on carbon. Are we moving in that direction? In fact, it's looking quite good. With the Biden summit tomorrow, we will have the three largest economic regions in the world aligning behind science. The US, the European Union, and China, all aligning, saying net zero between 2050 and 2060. This is positive. This might tip the scales on the logic on the world economy, because when the biggest economies say in one generation, we're out of this, we're going fossil fuel free, that will spill over also in the whole atmosphere around the Glasgow COP26. And then finally, just to say that COP26 will be the moment where we integrate nature with climate. And that is also a fundamental importance, to take the whole planetary boundary approach to decarbonizing the world economy.
And is there one industry sector which you've seen which has been able to turn around, and which we could potentially look at in terms of how sectors can reinvent themselves and look at a future that is fossil free? I mean, is there something in particular you'd like us to consider as a good example?
Well, I think that's what's so exciting right now. There are so many industries, sectors really experimenting and moving at scale. I mean, I think what we're seeing today in the car industry in the world, like the race to zero on electric mobility and fuel cells, is really exciting. What we're seeing with the European Union Bauhaus initiative on shifting from concrete to building and locking in carbon sinks with wood. What we're seeing with fossil fuel-free steel industry based on hydrogen experiments up in the northern parts of the Arctic, in the northern regions, my own home country, Sweden. The food industry is rapidly moving towards more zero carbon, plant-based solutions for diets. I mean, basically, I could go on. The textile industry, it's so exciting to see circular business models being developed. You have the big retail industries in the world. So I could go on a long time to find that we are, I would argue, on a tipping point here where we're shifting towards sustainability being the entry point at the boardrooms, at the CEO levels, at the marketing levels, to really be competitive in the future. So there's something happening. The challenge now is to go to scale.
Thank you. Now, a concluding question, and we have in our conference 2,500 marketers from 70 countries all around the world. So if there was one message you'd like to deliver today to that marketer community, what would that be?
That we have so much scientific evidence on the table today that there is no contradiction between profitability and sustainability. On the contrary, sustainability gives better competitiveness, better profits, and better bottom lines for companies, and also builds more resilient abilities to survive in a turbulent market future, as we know we have in front of us. So invest in sustainability if you want to be successful in the future.
Professor Rockström, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, and good luck with your work.
So, to go for a short break. So I'd like you to go to your schedule and click on the link to the next session, and see you in a bit. Thank you.